Hello everybody and welcome back to Down to Earth. We're excited to have you here for season 2 with myself and Melissa and back here with Uncle Marty. So Uncle Marty, I just wanted to go over some of the stats that you'd given us last season, and we talked about how this kind of explosive growth for Christ had happened overseas from 5,000 followers to well over 1 million in a very short period of time. And we'd had this moment last season where we'd kind of had this really heartfelt prayer for revival here in America. And so I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through a little bit of how we could bring that growth here to America.
Well, that was our dream and our prayer that day that we had here back a few sessions back. Actually, in Praxis and Simple Church are partners. They have been working here in North America and also further afield in Western Europe and so forth. And there's now probably about 250 house churches within that network.
Between here and Europe?
Between here and Europe, yes. Okay. And Canada and so forth. And it seems like every week it's growing more and more. The director of Simple Church, he's right now training people in Europe to do house church. It just seems like every month there's more and more openness. And so we foresee something similar happening here in viral growth in the U.S. as well.
I know that one question that we brought up last season as well was what would be the target audience for house church? Because at least for us here, we all have churches that we go to and communities and you know, it's kind of a family deal and all that. So
interestingly, as we talked about last season as well, just to recap for those who might not have been present, about 93% of Americans say that religion is important for them, that Christianity is important for them, spirituality is important for them. But probably only 40% of Americans say they will actually go to a brick and mortar constructed church. As you dig deeper, we find that there's only 20% of Americans today who actually go to church on a regular basis.
Sheesh.
For example, the other 20% will go for a funeral, for a marriage,
Easter,
Christmas, maybe for a special invitation. But there has been a mass exodus from church over the last 15 to 20 years. So you have big mega churches, and a lot of the little churches are empty as you travel around the U.S., whether they're Adventist churches or cross-denominationally. We find just an emptying of the churches. So even Adventist churches, if you look at the statistics, we're 1.25 million Adventists, and maybe 300,000 on any given Sabbath show up to a church, at least from the statistics. Now, there could be many pastors or local church secretaries that aren't turning in their statistics, but it's actually a very low number. There's people who rotate through church, and many who have not been for a very, very long time.
And a lot of those are young people.
And a lot of those are young people. So even in the last 5 years, there's been a big walking away from church of church elders, church secretaries, deacons. They're saying we're no longer being satisfied in contemporary traditional style churches. And so there is a big movement. They still want to be connected to God, but they want to be more authentic, more real. And so they want to feel real community. And so to reach out to the 60% of Americans who wouldn't go to a traditional church, and maybe even larger, 80% of Americans believe that the time for simple house churches has come.
You kind of pulled out this word community, and I know I've heard you talk about like Acts type churches before.
Yes.
How do you see those kind of coming in and actually affecting groups of people who wouldn't go to a regular brick and mortar church?
Well, I see that people are desperate for community. I mean, if we just look at statistics, like my father's generation or grandfather's generation, they had 12 to 15 friends. My father's had 10 to 12 friends. My generation, it's cut like to half, you know, to have really, really deep friends that stay with you through life. And it keeps getting lower and lower. And many of those friendships have been broken up due to the mass relocation around the U.S., even just being caught up with how American culture is today. There's a big hungering for deep friendship and deep sense of community. So we're seeing in these house churches that we've mentioned, not only in, let's say, about the 250 that we're involved with indirectly, but with the wider house church movement in America, there's this longing we have found of people having a real sense of community, of sharing what was really going on with them this week.
I have a coworker at work, and I was sharing with him a little bit about the idea of house church at one point. One of the questions that he asked me was, there's tons of churches around. Why can't these guys go to, if they're looking for community, there's people there who can provide them with community. So how does that differ?
Well, I'll tell you, I think people today really want community as well. And in a setting where you can be authentic, be real, share your real issues or things that happen easier in a house setting among close friends, or at least building a community of close friends happens in a much easier way. And I think to reach beyond those people who would no longer step inside a church. This isn't for everyone. It's not to take people away from a traditional church, but a few people from traditional church says, we're going to step out in faith, we're going to start a house church to reach my kids, to reach my neighbors, to reach those people who would not come to traditional church anymore.
Reach out to the biker gang down the road.
To reach down.
The refugees that have just arrived.
Exactly.
Okay. No, that makes
Really
sense.
folks that are offended by church or maybe just the image of church.
Yeah, or they just have zero interest. Many Americans are already 3 generations outside of Christianity, so that's like clueless
Yeah.
what it is.
So it's post-Christianity.
It's a post-Christian world. Many of them say, yeah, we believe in Jesus. We want to have a spiritual life, but we don't want to be a part. And it's like we mentioned, there's been this big moving away from institutionalism. And we have never been at a place where we've been at such a massive low on what we believe about government. If you look at the statistics, it's like 23% of Americans really trust the government any longer, trust the health system, trust the educational system, trust traditional science. And one of the things people don't trust anymore is the religious institutions. And so they don't want to go into a denominationally networked brick and mortar church, you might say. So there's just this very strong resistance to anything institutional. And so
almost looking for something grassroots or
looking for something grassroots that they can be a part of.
Well, and you can see that just in society in general when you look at a lot of these stores that are selling goods from overseas, and you're buying purses made by women who are in shelters or things like that. A lot of our generation wants to be involved in something that I feel like this is actually helping people here. I know.
help a cause.
Yeah, help a cause or help the average Joe, I guess you could say. Because I know around Christmas last year, I had a friend who was posting on Facebook, hey guys, here's some really good shops to buy from instead of buying from, say, Amazon or somewhere like that, because you're impacting local people's lives.
Yeah.
And this is something that we've found that's really important in house church. Someone in the group is struggling financially and the group says, we're all going to pitch in. Or someone notices that the next door neighbor is 80 years old and has some house needs. Let's just all go today together as our house church and we're going to go help Mrs. Jones clean her house. And so it now becomes very real. It's hard to do that when you have a large church to go and really do an impact in the community. But now you go as a small group, as a group of friends and say, we're just going to help you. Or you know what, we know you can't make your mortgage this month. Here you go, James. Here's the money to make your mortgage. And so we've just seen a lot of caring happen. And then they feel that, wow, these people cared enough to help me pay my mortgage. You know, they will be with you for life. And they will say, if Jesus impacted you, I want to be a part of Jesus too.
So it's real community, because I know, like, in this social media world that we basically live in, you know, you got your 1,400 friends or 700 or 800, however many. You feel like you've got community there because you go scroll through the feed every once in a while and you're like, okay, I've caught up with everybody. But it's kind of a false sense of it, I guess.
It's very impersonal. I don't have to be real in front of you because I can show you what I want you to see of me.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
If people were interested in Simple Church and wanting to look something up on their phone or their computer while we're talking today, where would they go?
Google Simple Church at Home.
Okay.
And you'll bring up a website.
Okay.
And there's a lot of videos, a lot of explanations. How do you start a house church? We'll lead you step by step what can be done
Okay.
and how to start a house church at home.
Cool.
Nice. So moving into the next section then, let's talk about Jesus and some of the things that he did, kind of
Yes.
going through discipling and this sort of thing.
Absolutely, Caleb. And as you had brought up at the beginning, the question was, why are these house churches really taking off? And we had talked about the important component, as you said, was the whole thing of house church. And house churches go viral. It's like a between a rabbit and an elephant. A rabbit can reproduce extremely fast, and have a big elephant, it takes years and years to build even a small herd of elephants.
Yeah.
And so this is definitely a very big component, but something that we have seen that has been absolutely foundational is people seeing the Bible and seeing Jesus, the different faces of Jesus, in a brand new light that they've never seen. So like in an Islamic context, they start reading through inductively the Bible and saying, wow, Jesus speaks into these and these areas of our lives. And I would say one of the biggest things is seeing that Jesus impacts not just our spirituality, you might say a religious aspect, but as I have really analyzed what has happened in the ministries, Jesus has impacted 8 areas of life. And what are these? And they've seen this in the Bible, and you'll say, how can this be? But we'll look over the next few weeks some of these areas. So they've seen that Jesus significantly comes in and impacts how you deal as a family, how you see yourself, how you see the community, civil society, how you see the judicial system, the legal system, how do you confront injustices within the justice system. And Jesus gives examples from the Bible to do this. How do you deal with economy, with finances? How do you deal with an unjust tax system? How do you deal with the military, corrupt military? How do you deal with a corrupt government? Are there forms of godly government? And finally, let's look at our relationship with God. So we basically find that there's 8 components that we have seen so far or analyzed where God comes in, but at the very foundation of this, we find that Jesus calls us to be disciples.
So hold on a second, Uncle Marty. It feels like a little bit as you're leading into these 8 components that we'll be going over the next few weeks, and you're saying it kind of all falls under the umbrella of discipleship. I'm going with maybe this is the 3rd theme that kind of goes with the other 2 we've gone over since the beginning of this whole journey we've all been on, of seeing how, number 1, looking for where God is already working makes a big impact in just seeing multiplications, as it were, of people coming into faith in Jesus. And then number 2 was house churches, which we've talked about a little bit. So are you saying the 3rd, if we were to look at 3 aspects that are just very important to movements, as it were, it would be these 3?
It would be discipleship. It would be those 3.
Okay.
It'd be finding where God is working, developing effective house churches.
Community, as
Community.
it were, be it in a regular church or house church.
Yes, and 3 is really learning what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus and how this impacts every area of life.
Okay.
I would say the very foundation of all of this is discipleship, and I'd like to share today from a biblical first century perspective, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus?
Okay.
And my big question before was, I used to think disciples were from that time. Back a few years ago, I was really hit, if we're really going to have viral growth, we need to understand how viral growth happened in the past. I looked at the time of the Protestant Reformation, of major revivals and movements throughout Christian history, and then way back to the very first century. And so it went back, and this Matthew 28 kept hitting me. Go you therefore and make disciples of all nations. So the big question was, what did discipleship mean? Now I'd like to explain just very briefly this morning, what does it mean to be a disciple? And to understand that, we need to understand in the context of the first century Galilee and Judea. They had 3 areas of education for their children and for their young people. And you would start there when you were 5 or 6 years old, and you would go for several years. The core part of those first several years of education of your primary school consisted in memorizing the first 5 books of Moses. And so you would memorize, you would come to class, you would learn to read, you would learn to write, you would learn about Jewish history, you would learn some music, some poetry, but your main class every day was memorize the Pentateuch.
I need to apologize to my dad. My dad made us memorize Genesis 1 through 3 when we were little, and I thought that was the worst thing ever. Trying to memorize the whole Bible would be a whole nother thing.
So this was kind of considered standard for boys and girls in Galilee. Most families in Galilee at the time of Jesus could afford to pay for the girls. And so after that, most children would then go and join their fathers, their uncles, or someone else in the community as an apprentice to learn a skill. And they would go.
They're about 8 or 9 years old. at this point then?
Yeah, they're 8, 9, 10, something like this. Sometimes up to 12 that they have finished memorizing the Old Testament.
So it's not necessarily a year, it's when you get that.
It's when
much
you get
memorized.
this. So some could memorize it quickly, and you would get the other things down, but you graduated when you finished memorizing the Pentateuch. Now, the local person who was guiding this was called a rabbi. And many local synagogues would hire a rabbi for their community to run their school. Now, the very best of these students who had memorized very well, the teacher would start in the middle of a sentence, and you could run the sentence after, the sentence before, because they didn't have verses. So the teacher would just start with a sentence, and you would even have to say before and after quickly, and then just keep memorizing. The one who was really good, and he showed a lot of future, the rabbi at the end of the time after the kids had graduated from learning, he would come to the parents and say, I have very good news for you. I believe your son is worth it to continue his education. And so there would be a big celebration of the family. That rabbi would write a recommendation or talk to a rabbi of a little bigger village or another school in the town and recommend him to go on to secondary school. So in secondary school, the first one is called Beit Safir, the second one is called Beit Midrash. And they would go to the secondary school, and now they would have to learn the whole rest of the Old Testament by memory. And not just memorize the whole Old Testament, but now they had to know the meaning of it and the interpretations of traditional Jewish understanding of the text, the commentaries.
So they're not just a walking Bible, they're a walking commentary.
They're a walking commentary. So by the time you end religious education of high school, you're a walking commentary. You know a lot more about your history. You've learned mathematics. You know how to run a small business. You have a pretty rounded, not only biblical education, but an education to be a small business person as well. Most people dropped out here, and now you were considered pretty important. If you didn't go into business, you could run a local school as well yourself, especially a primary school. And it was quite prestigious to have finished this level in your community. Well, the very best of the best now, their teacher, if they said this person really mastered learning the Old Testament by memory, really knows the commentaries, I recommend him now to go for university level education. And this was a great honor for the families. And there would be, again, a great celebration. And so they would have a recommendation from their local rabbi saying, I'm recommending so-and-so to get further education. Now, the very best rabbis in the country, like Gamaliel that we hear of in the New Testament, you couldn't just go ask him, can I study under you? It was set up much like sports clubs today. And he would have agents out searching the land for the very best of the best students across the Jewish world. And he would take only the brightest. And so they would have a whole time, it'd be almost like getting into a very prestigious Ivy League university, getting into the best football club. It was quite a process. So Gamaliel, for example, he has his agents looking out to find the best of the best. And so if you're the best of the best, now you go and study under a great rabbi. These great rabbis, just an average rabbi at university level, he would have a classroom. But the best of the best would be roving professors. And they would grab a group of 10, 12, they wouldn't take any bigger than this, and then they would travel giving local judgments and teaching their students, instead of from a book and from explanations and examples, from real life examples on the street.
It's like school on the road.
It's school on the road. So if you were called by a rabbi like this, it was the greatest privilege. Because even though you wouldn't be a rich person, if you graduated from here, you would be a rabbi who had the power to give judicial judgment. So you come to a town and they will listen to you. They would come and ask you all kinds of questions, and your word was binding if you asked him to give you judgment.
So if you were one of the top rabbis, you almost had a lawyer, judge type role.
Exactly.
As well as a spiritual role.
Exactly. You have a dual role there. So you can give spiritual recommendations, but also your word is binding. You can't come and just force yourself on a thing, but if two brothers are in a fight, like we remember in the case of Jesus, a brother comes and asks Jesus to give a judgment. If he asks Jesus to give a judgment to a traveling rabbi, Now his word is binding on the family and you have to keep it.
And so then what did they call these people who followed rabbis
So
around?
these people who followed rabbis around were called disciples. And so now there's a few things that are very important to understand of the relationship between the rabbi and his disciples.
Okay.
Today, when students come to a teacher, you're wanting basically in our Western system to learn the knowledge that the teacher has for you. But when these disciples came, they wanted not just the knowledge, but they wanted to take the spirit. I mean, you wanted to live like he lived. And he would choose you. He would say, follow me. If you've gone through the process, you're hoping he will call you, he would say, follow me. And then you would follow your rabbi. And you would learn to live like he lived. You would learn to think how he thought. You would learn to act as he acted. And so we see an example of Jesus. He's walking on water. The only one who gets out of the boat to do what Jesus is doing is Peter. And the rabbis in their tradition would call people who they believed could do what they did. And what we see is that Peter stops thinking that he can be as the master, as Jesus as his rabbi. And he then sinks.
That's a very different perspective, I guess, to that story than I've ever thought of it before. It kind of puts it into perspective. If we're supposed to be disciples of Jesus, number one, how well are we emulating Christ? How well are we actually thinking about being true disciples, I guess, in this sense? Are we just studying and just being followers of Jesus? Or are we actually trying to emulate him? Or are we being like Peter when he started to walk on the water and starting and then saying, well, I can't be like this guy, so there's no way that I can be a follower of his?
Well, I think a key point is, in Revelation it says they followed the Lamb wherever he went. And to a first century audience, they says, wow, Jesus is asking us to go wherever he asks us to go, but he gives us the enabling power. He believes that we can do it. And our rabbi will give us what we need to be able to follow him where he goes. And I see this as what Jesus wants us. He wants us to step out in this radical faith today, that if Jesus healed people, I can heal. If Jesus asks us to go the second mile, we can do this.
That's a big thing. So to understand it, the rabbi would only call people that he thought could do the things that he did, correct?
Yes.
So essentially you're having this confidence from the rabbi that he sees that you can do it. So that's a big thing.
And the incredible thing, Jesus doesn't call the best of the best. He calls a wide gamut of people who were fishermen, Matthew, a tax collector who would have never been called. He calls Simon the Zealot, who was a terrorist of his time. He calls this almost motley group of people that he brings together and says, you don't have to be the best of the best. Any of you can follow me. And then he says, go make the world disciples.
Jumping off of the making the world disciples, maybe we can share a little bit with our audience about the journey we've started on. We've spent some time here in the studio praying and asking God, how can we help to see this massive movement happen for Jesus? And we all kind of sat and brainstormed and talked a little bit about all this. How do we make this happen? What do we do to help further the work, as it were? And ended up deciding, first of all, to take the show on the road. So we took this show on the road, and Caleb, being a musician, kind of added in a bit of a concert component. And then after that first event on the road that we did, we had several young people who came up to us and said, hey, we want to start house churches. We have unique niches in the community that we really feel we could reach as Adventist young people through a house church movement. We had a young guy who really felt like he could do something at a public university. We have another young woman who's a nurse, and she's a night shifter, and she sees all these other night shifters who are also struggling to still have community in church and even make it to church when you're on such a nocturnal schedule. We had a young couple who are just struggling with finding where they fit, and we're looking, how do we help our friends in that aspect as well? So we started a house church for a few weeks.
We have. It's been an exciting journey so far, and we've done some training because it looks like several of these people will actually step out and start their own house churches. So we started an initial phase to let's do house church together. Let's do some training of how we can actually do house church, and it's just been an exciting last few weeks.
It has. I think we've just got a few more weeks to go before some of them decide to jump up on their own. But I know for me, I've had different people ask us, questions as to why house church, and am I planning on doing house church for the whole rest of my life and all of that. I know Caleb's had some of those questions too. And for me, it's been really cool to see these young people, especially my peers, spend time getting very real with themselves and really applying who Jesus is in their lives. And to see them start out on their journey, there's still, I guess, a little bit of an internal struggle for me in the sense that I have a really close church family. So I know for me, stepping out and doing a complete house church, movement is not something I will be doing. But it's been really cool to see these young people with a passion and desire to reach these certain niches and just see how God's potentially going to be using them.
I know for me, just in the 5 weeks
Yep.
that we've been together, it feels like it's a lot more community-oriented. And you get to know these people much quicker, just in the way that it's set up with kind of an icebreaker at the beginning, talking about highs and lows of the week.
And people get real. Like, people are
Yeah.
actually willing to share things that I wouldn't. This is my high and this is my low of the week that
Yeah.
have come out, have been like, oh my stars, I don't think
Yeah.
I ever would have even shared that with my closest friends, much less in
I
a-
think it's
a group
those
of
people that build that community, though, too, because they're willing to be vulnerable with everybody else. And so they're like, oh, they feel safe to do that here, so I do, too. It's a safe environment with a close group of people. It's not big. We
10
got
people.
8, 10 people there. I really enjoy the church I go to, but it's so big, it's hard to connect with people.
Well, I think that's
So-
one of the real key things to really become real, as my kids say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, maybe as we close out this episode, why don't we say a special prayer for those people who are going into this house church movement or are currently involved in a house church of some sort? Caleb, you want to maybe lead us in prayer?
Sure. Well, dear God, thank you for today, and just thank you that we could spend some time here talking about discipleship and what that looks like and getting a clearer picture of that. And so we just pray that you would come and pour out your Spirit here in America, especially on these house church movements. And just please come soon and take us home with you. In your name, amen.
And we look forward to seeing you guys next week on Down to Earth.